Welcome back to the 30th Annual HACR Symposium afternoon session. Here to introduce our next session, Learning Lessons, Secrets from Diversity Leadership, please welcome back HACR Senior Vice President of Operations and Interim Director of Research, Sylvia Perez Cash.
Hello, hello. How is everyone feeling? High energy, good to go? That's right, thank you. Well, I'm excited for this next panel. It is our last formal session of the day before you get to what I know you really came here for, our grand reception on Spire 73 today. Don't lie, all right? But this is going to be great, so thank you for staying with us today. Again, thank you to our virtual audience. We couldn't do this without each and every one of you. Our moderator for this next session, the Learning Lessons, Secret from Diversity Leadership, is a familiar face to many of you and definitely to us there. She's a dear friend of mine as well. Before she moved on to become the Assistant Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Belonging at Penn State University, she served as the Executive Vice President and Director of Research at HACR. I am thrilled to be in her shadow and following in her leadership. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the moderator for our next session, the Assistant Vice President for Diversity of Equity and Belonging at Penn State University, Dr. Lisette Garcia. Also joining her is our distinguished panel.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today. As Sylvia said, I am a former HACR employee, so it's wonderful to be back and to be here sort of on this side of the stage instead of running around behind the scenes making sure everything's going as designed, right? So thrilled to also be here for this part of our conversation where we have two distinguished guests who will be sharing their insights with us, not only about their professional career and offering advice to folks as they choose to advance their own careers, but also sharing some insights with us about the field of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which I think is really important for us to talk about, and it's a really important way for us to close out our day today. So joining me today is Wendy Lewis, Executive Consultant at Wendy Lewis, LLC, and Brian Tippins, the former president at the HPE Foundation. And we're going to kick off our conversation just by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourselves, your career, and what you're doing these days.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lisette. And thank you, Sid and family HACR. I have had the pleasure and privilege of working with many of you in my former life at Major League Baseball and then at McDonald's. And Sid and the team here have been a phenomenal partner, strategic partner for me in my career. And I just want to just tell you in person how grateful I am of the support that you gave me in my role and how I want to continue to work and support you and yours. So first of all, gracias. So I come to you formally with Major League Baseball and formally with McDonald's, in both as the Chief Diversity Officer and in Major League Baseball 30 years, at McDonald's 4 years. And so now that is why I am a single and doing Wendy Lewis LLC. So looking forward to discussing more about me and what I can share with you as we go along.
Thank you. Brian?
I echo the thanks. It's such an honor to be here. It's such a great pleasure to be in person, in groups, in a live space for the first time in a long time, which is always great. Great energy in the room. Thank you for allowing me to be here, and thanks to Sid and the HACR team. We've had a long association, which has been great. I, like Victoria, on my bio also says, I used to be all about deep conditioning my curls. But less so these days. My last role, I was just telling the team, I'm about 30 days-ish into semi-retirement. I recently departed Hewlett-Packard Enterprise after a 22-year career with HPE. and had done a few years with Intel Corporation before that. In terms of kind of bio, I was lucky enough to grow up in a home where my late father, who did not have a college education, had gone to trade school to learn how to program. We didn't call them developers back in those days, it was programmers. So even back in the 1980s, we had computers in our home. And so I grew up as a tech nerd, a tech geek. I was destined to be a techie in my career, and went to university and learned management information systems and moved into law school, not to become a lawyer in practice, but to become a more distinguished IT professional. And so, as I mentioned, a little bit of time in Intel, a long career at HP, HPE, doing at sometimes technical roles, legal roles, notably for about 5 years as our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and most recently as our Chief Sustainability Officer, building out an environmental program, which was quite strong, into a more comprehensive environmental and social governance ESG program, and all that entails, and also got to serve as president of the foundation. So lots of experience to sort of draw on, and may look for some of your advice into what to do in my years of retirement.
Well, and I think we're going to talk about a little bit about some of that as our time passes, because I think we are seeing a trend with diversity work specifically becoming more intertwined with ESG, and so it'd be great to kind of hear both of your thoughts on that as we progress. But let's talk a little bit about how the field has changed over the years, right? So thinking back to the field at the start of your career and what doing diversity work meant then to now, let's talk a little bit about how that has changed over time, perhaps.
You know, I started my first day in what would become a formal diversity role was actually with Major League Baseball, and no matter what I thought it was, it ended up being a cubicle in the accounting department. And I would call around to the other clubs to find out, you know, from my great Tribune experience, you know, essentially, what are you doing, what we would call best practices. And I got a lot of, I don't even know what you're talking about, we don't do that in baseball. And so I had the distinct honor, before I knew it, to find out I was the one, literally one. When I started, there was no such thing as a formal human resource role, and definitely no such thing as what we refer to as today, DEI. And so after a while, I got this honor from a group, and it was a Pioneer Award. And Pilar said earlier that, you know, she was, you know, just at the half-century mark, so she was too young to be considered legacy. But at not much older than her, they were giving me a Pioneer Award, and I didn't understand it at the time. And one of the suppliers I was working with corrected me in my thinking about what it means to be a pioneer. And he said, Wendy, where I come from, being a pioneer means you are the first, but literally the first to the outside. So you are the first that goes in land and territory where no one else has gone. Yours is the first flesh that the animals smell. Yours are the feet that get cut up and hurt and bruised because you're creating path for people. You are the first to knock down the impediments so others can come through. And quite often, he says, where I come from, the pioneers never make it out of the bush. You just get it started. And I remember looking at him saying, you can keep that. And don't ever call me a pioneer again. So I, you know, in all candor, that's a true story. But it also gave me an amazing opportunity to build, to grow, to develop, to actually create practice. And that is such an amazing opportunity and a blessing and a privilege to do. So all I can say is from where I came to where we are now is obviously dramatically different. But for some of you, you're going to be the first in your organization because now it's hot, it's everywhere. And for some of you, it's the first time you're ever going to have that role. So the reality is you're going to still feel the angst of the pioneering spirit, but I'm telling you, it's a miraculous time to discover that skill set and lead your organizations in this practice. So, you know, no worse for the wear. It's okay.
My experience is so similar. So I'm also like Pilar in my half-century year this year. And because I'm on retirement, we've been doing the farewell celebrations, the cocktail receptions with the executive leader saying goodbye, Brian, and thank you for your contribution. And in one of those, this word legacy kept coming up again and again and again. And it started to feel more like a eulogy than a celebration, right? It's like, I'm not gone yet, right? But legacy in that I came into the role in 2016 in a company that had long had some program around diversity and inclusion, but it was different. It was affirmative action. It was purely compliance driven. It was different than what has emerged in the time that I've been in this space. And I was lucky to come into a space and coming from the lens of tech at a time when we had a problem. We were trying to solve tech's diversity problem. The narrative at the time was Silicon Valley, mostly white, mostly male. What are we going to do to provide a level of transparency and action around creating opportunity in the tech space for all of us? And so we were solving a problem, trying to push a rock up a hill, but we evolved from affirmative action and compliance to, oh crap, let's do something because we're in trouble now, to really migrating towards a business imperative. So I agree when you say now's a hot time. It's a great time to be in this space. Not that it's easy by any means. There's still trials and tribulations, but certainly easy to drive a program or easier to drive a program when there's some level of understanding that it's not just about the touchy-feely nice thing to do. I think we're beginning to get this understanding that it's a business imperative. You hear CEOs and companies say things like our diversity strategy or our ESG strategy is inextricably bound to our business strategy, and I think we're moving towards a position where that's becoming more and more true.
I want to add to Brian's comment, because being in the space, for so long, they've been saying that for so long. Yeah. And I would say the challenge now is everybody woke up one day and discovered, what is this thing is real, and it's become a matter of life and death for my business, for my people, for my communities. And so the biggest difference is now there is a sweeping attitude change. I mean, literally seismic mindset change around this. So for those of you who've been in it and at it for a while, I'm sure that you have experienced this degree of time and attention and higher expectation and accountability. But understand that going forward, we have a tremendous amount of work to do, because I would challenge, if that's what was being said when I got this party started almost 40 years ago, it is still ringing true. What's missing? The number one thing that's missing is we cannot keep doing what we've always been doing. I don't care how good at it you are. And I would challenge that the last 3 years changes everything.
Well, so let's talk about that a little bit, right? So thinking about everything that has happened in our society over the past several years, we are seeing change, right? I think you're both agreeing that we're seeing some change. We're seeing inroads being made in this field, but there are still areas that have these barriers where we've not seen much progress, where we aren't seeing things really changing. What would you say those opportunity areas are, and what advice would you give to folks who perhaps are tasked with making inroads or making changes in those areas?
I'd say at a fundamental level, it's about understanding and articulating the business case of why we do this. I would say reflecting on the last 3 years, and we've even seen ups and downs in the past 3 years, I would argue that on some level we've taken our foot off the gas, unfortunately need to apply continued pressure. Elliot mentioned being from Chicago, so I harken back to former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who's Obama chief of staff, who said, never waste a good controversy, right? Take advantage of and capitalize on this moment. Take advantage of the badness that we must all deal with and that open door to lean in. But as you do so, think about that business case. Like, why is this important to us? It can't just be because of the controversy or because it's a nice thing to do. And I always have articulated in the context of 3 C's of diversity. The first being compliance. How do we articulate how winning in this space helps us tick the box on compliance everywhere we do business in the world? Whether it's because we have to be accountable to the EEOC in the United States, or the state of California on board composition, or because in Brazil, a percentage of our team members that we hire have to be persons with disabilities. Like, everywhere in the world where you do business, you can't run afoul of compliance requirements. That's table stakes. The second C is corporate social responsibility. It must enhance the image and brand. And all your annual reports, you see a brown person and a black person, a person in a wheelchair. The touchy-feely nice thing to do. We've got to do that and talk about how the diversity of our workforce reflects the diversity of our customers and the communities where we do business, that is something we must do. But the most important C is certainly that last C, which is competitive advantage. How can you clearly articulate with data that leadership in this space helps us to win new business, whether it's because having diversity attracts more diversity and we can attract the best and brightest workforce at a time we're in a fight for talent, or because we can be more innovative, or because we're B2B and our business customers have requirements of their own that we have to meet and to win new business, or because we're in a consumer-facing business and we know that communities of color are brand loyal, right? How can we articulate why doing this is the right thing to do from a business standpoint? I think at foundation level.
I'm going to add another C, so we can have 4, and that is the cultural transformation. And without it, people will continue to not want to work with you, not want to work for you. Consumers will turn their back on your product, and you won't even know that it's happening. Folks now are ahead of you in this proof point. I find it remarkable that folks, leaders, don't understand why people don't want to come back to the workplace, remote at best. And I would say that if the environment was toxic before, you're going to actually have to convince me that it's anti-toxic today. And that's the work that's not being put in there. So for those who are doing this work, embracing this work, or aligning with this work, you got to be a part of that cultural transformation so those other C's can happen as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I know most companies are really struggling with that right now, trying to get their folks to come back into the office on a full-time basis. And we have had conversation after conversation of, how do we make it worth their while, right? Like, how do we prove to them that we've learned and we're making changes and that the environment isn't going to be toxic, that they are going to feel like they belong and that their voice is being heard? And I think, for the most part, folks are forgetting that piece of it, right? Like they're not thinking about that belonging piece. They're not thinking about how to ensure that everyone feels like they have, a voice and that their contribution is important, aside from, making widgets, right? If that's what your responsibility is at your particular company. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about some, career advice and thinking about the illustrious careers that you have both had in your lifetime. Can you share with us an early career mistake or failure that you had, and how you use that as a lesson of learning for the future?
Oh man, there's so many. I would say, so I came to the Chicago Cubs. That was the beginning of my sports career from way of Tribune Company. And Tribune Company was really, really good at you understanding how the business worked. And Tribune going into the sports franchise business was one of their newest acquisitions. And a funny story that I won't take up our time right now, but that's a tease for me to tell you later. I ended up getting the role at the Cubs, and all that's cool. And my first mistake was not understanding how totally different the culture was. Different like nothing I've ever experienced. I'm a sports fan. I went to Cubs game. I used to, when I was in sales and marketing, I would take my clients to do, sports events. So I know the Cubs. I know Chicago Cubs, right? But I get there as this new role, this new management role, and the place was ice cold. I had never experienced anything like that. And my first lesson was, you're not the smartest kid in class if you don't know the school. And I realized I had to do a backup and really, really understand the culture. Because coming in, I couldn't believe what they didn't do and had not started and got away with blah, blah, blah. The reality was, the light came on for me real quick. This business was here before I got here, long before I got here, and will be here long after I leave. So something here is right. So I had to wait and learn and pay attention and be quiet till I really understood more about culture. And that was my first education over something that people so commonly say that, culture is strategy for lunch or whatever day it is. But the reality is that is so true, so true. Whatever is that operating environment that you're in, the culture of that is going to be the key to your success.
Thank you.
I love that story. I should have said at the outset, please tweet me. At Brian Tippins on Twitter, LinkedIn. We can connect and be social. I'm a massive social media nerd, so please, and catch me in an Obama pose when I do like this. So the thing for me, and I love that story, and I want to build on that. And Elliot made me think of this when he talked about his upbringing and being quite conservative and not wanting to stand out too much and just kind of go and be quiet and don't be seen. I think without making sweeping cultural generalizations, some of us kind of grow up that way, at least in my generation. And it's not just our cultures. I think many cultures outside the majority culture are the same way. But I had a time early in my career, my first leadership role, I was a manager, people manager, and I was looking after supplier diversity at the time. All of our companies have supplier diversity programs that are all around how we increase spend with ethnic minority-owned business, women-owned businesses, et cetera. And so you know the landscape. A lot of it's dealing with suppliers, but a lot of it's dealing with the network and the minority business magazines and the trade fairs. And there's lots of awards and accolades. And there was a time in my career where I was spending more time outside the company than inside the company, trying to build reputation for our company. And we were getting lots of awards for HP, and that was great. But there was a lot of Brian Tippins awards, too, for the work that we were doing. And at first, I would go tell my manager, hey, we won this. Hey, I was in this magazine. Hey, I did this. And then I got to the point where I was being quite sheepish about it. I didn't want to make too much noise and seem like I was being self-serving and doing this for the glorification of my own name. And so we were at an off-site team event with my boss. I'm going to call him out because it's on video. Nick was his name. And Nick and I, at the end of the day-long team meetings, we went to the bars, which we're prone to do as corporate folks, and we're having a drink and reflecting on the day. And he says to me, Brian, I've noticed you've been getting a lot of awards. I was like, oh, crap, here it comes. I notice you're on magazines and you're spending a lot of time outside. And I'm like, what's coming now? It's going to be a slap on the hand. He says, I wish my other procurement leaders were viewed in the same way as thought leaders. I'd like you to form a speakers bureau of sorts. How can you help my other leaders? And so the lesson out of that was don't shy away from your greatness, right? Lean into that, right? We sometimes in our careers are apologetic about that which we know. People say it's not who you know, it's what you know. People say it's not what you know, it's who you know. Sometimes I think it's about who knows what you know. And sometimes in order to get them to know, we have to pat ourselves on the back in the right way and sing our own praises, right? Not with huge ego, but not to be sheepish about that which we do well, to lean into that where we lead. And that was a mistake I made early on, not doing enough of that. I encourage us to do more of that earlier on in our careers.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. And I think, we oftentimes struggle with that self-promotion piece versus, wanting for people to really just see what it is that we're doing, because so many of us out here are doing so much more than just what we're supposed to be doing in our day-to-day roles, right? And I think it's important to ensure that that information is getting out there. So I have a few more planned questions, but I want to make sure that everybody's getting primed and ready to ask Wendy and Brian their questions, and that includes our audience that's with us virtually. So get your questions in the chat, and those of you who are here in the room with us, be thinking about what it is that you want to ask. Since we have them here, you should take advantage of this collective wisdom that's on the stage. So, Brian, I want to come back to the idea that you mentioned before about ESG, right? And thinking about ESG and its relationship to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. What do you think companies need to know? What do they need to do, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I'd say it goes back to the concept that was mentioned so many times in the last panel, this idea of intersectionality, but intersectionality in those areas of purpose for our companies. So ESG, overused acronym right now, but it's around environmental, social, and governance. At no time has there been more focus on this topic than right now. At all parts of the business, it's around making sure that companies address a wide set of stakeholders. In the past, in fact, I remember in law school and corporations class being taught that the purpose of the corporation was to maximize shareholder value. That was all we existed to do. But that has evolved and morphed over time to move away from purely shareholder primacy to how do we impact communities, how do we impact our employees, how do we make an impact in the world. And it's not just a nice thing to do. Companies now recognize, driven by the Business Roundtable and other consortia, that that's really important. And because it's important, the investors that invest in our companies, our shareholders, everyone's very keen on what do we do in the ESG space. And as we've gotten into this, we start, most companies, with that which we can measure easily, and it's usually environmental, right? It starts with the E in ESG. I can measure carbon neutrality or carbon emissions or diversion of waste from landfills, all that green stuff, but it's growing. And there's a big focus on now elevating the S in ESG. What does social mean? And of course, it started with what can we easily measure? What's the diverse makeup of your board of directors, of your workforce? But it's getting quite broad, right? It's around fair labor working conditions, pay equity, days work without injury, all those elements of social impact of a company. What philanthropic investments do we make? How do we mobilize in our communities? All those social things. And the fact that we've gotten the scrutiny here, and the scrutiny is not coming just from the investment community, but governments around the world, including the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, that is now looking at companies and that which we do. I think this creates a moment. The moment where there's so much focus in this space, it's a great opportunity for us as diversity and inclusion practitioners to think how we expand outside of our silos of doing HR stuff to really helping drive our ESG agenda for our company, whatever that means organizationally. I have seen and predict that we'll see many more companies begin to collect those functions into one senior leader. Call that leader chief purpose officer, head of ESG, whatever. Some of our companies may be on that journey, but you'll see at some point, I believe, in many companies, HR and governmental affairs and environmental and philanthropy and under one leader to combine that story. But if you're not there yet, lean in and to understand how the work that you're doing in D&I helps influence your broader ESG story to help reinforce that business proposition.
And I think, you know, one of the things that you just said that I think really strikes me is the fact that sometimes this work is so siloed, right? Oh. And we really need to kind of break away from that and really be thinking about this more broadly, right? And not just thinking about it from the perspective of what happens with talent or what happens with suppliers, but it's even sometimes about the products that we make. It's even sometimes about the markets that we go into and the services that we're offering, right? All of those things are really impacted by DE&I, and I think sometimes we lose sight of it because we think of it as being only an issue related to talent or only an issue related to you know, the development of that talent, recruiting them, bringing them in, developing them, but it really does sort of cut across all sectors of most companies, and the companies that are already thinking about it from that perspective are far better along, I think, than companies that are still thinking about it just as being something that HR is responsible for.
Completely agree, and we can wait, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. We can wait until there's an organizational construct to bring it all together or be proactive about how do we address it, particularly to the extent that we talked about money and budgets in the ERG discussion. Most D&I teams are probably operating on a shoestring, as is the philanthropy team, as is that marketing and advertising team that's working on our brand and communities. Why can't we work collectively on the things that have synergies to help drive? And so I think there's no reason, even if you don't have that organizational construct that brings it together, to do something informal and build those alliances to begin to bring them together.
That's what I wanted to add.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't apologize. It's okay. It's okay. Don't get in your way.
Yeah.
I believe, and a few of my CDO friends, they still have an issue with me because one of the things I am known to say often is we micromanage this. The focus is too narrow. We have been doing the talent pipeline, development, recruit, retention thing almost so singularly, we weren't paying attention. And the reality is, imagine, particularly those of you who've been doing this work for a while, if you had aligned yourself with or created that supplier diversity, which is now business diversity piece. If you had done more around community other than, you know, maybe being the gatekeeper for writing the check, but really looked a deeper dive into investment. So the reality is, this is how this is shifting. This is where this is going. Be in front of the room, not behind it, and not just even in the middle. So as you see this morphing towards something that is much more expansive, much more strategic, much more sustainable, don't be afraid of it. Go ahead and weigh in early rather than later.
And then on a very personal and selfish note, not that any of us ever aspire to leave the companies that paid for you to be here today, but it certainly makes one more marketable to be, and there's nothing wrong with being the diversity leader, procurement leader, but to be a purpose leader, to be environmental, social governance thought expert, right? A thought leader, to think of yourself from that broader point of view opens up lots of doors.
So I want to come back to something that I think, Brian, you said earlier, which was about legacy, right? And thinking about the careers that you've both had and the time that you've spent doing this work. You know, what is it that you want to be remembered for? What is that legacy that you're leaving?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. Again, that word legacy scares me, but it's good. It's an honor, and I take it for the spirit in which it's intended. I'd say a couple is I was very intentional in my time as Chief Diversity Officer to open up the doors of my company, my very conservative Silicon Valley company, to more black and brown faces than had ever been seen in that place, right? We always have the opportunity to host events at our companies, and I was very intentional about bringing in HACR and High Tech and Reverend Jackson and his team for a very intentional purpose. I needed to see more integration inside the company, and that was very important because of the optics and the role that we all play as role models. I tell people someone is always watching. Someone's always watching you. You're an example to many, no matter what level in the organization you sit. And so I'm very proud that I was always very conscious of the example that I set and intentionally being inspirational and motivational. I'm a different kind of dude, right? And I was very intentionally that way. I would very often speak on stages. I had the opportunity to speak at Davos at the World Economic Forum on a panel about joy in the workplace. And I say that from almost every stage because you need the young black professional to hear me say, I was at this panel in Davos and the World Economic Forum, right? I understand the purpose of my example, and so that's important. And the last I'll say is my superpower is there's no better riser upperer than me. I will speak about so many young folks in the room where it has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I'll say, are you aware of that work that Kay is doing? She should be on your radar screen, right? I'm an elevator. Think about your role as being a sponsor, whether you're an official sponsor or not, because we're all in a position to push up and pull up, as my friends in high tech always say. So just think of your example, your position as being an example, but also rising up those who come behind you.
My legacy, first of all, make sure that it doesn't become legacy, and I've had the opportunity to work for really great traditional organizations. Major League Baseball has been around a long time. McDonald's has been around a long time. So I have really just been a creature of innovation my whole life. As a kid, my mom taught home economics, and sewing was one of the classes she had that just spectacular stuff got made and developed. And as young as a kid, sitting underneath the dining room table, I'm taking my Barbies, and by the time I put my Barbie on the table, she has on a turban and a sarong. I mean, fly. My dolls were incredible. So I've been a sort of a creature of, kind of taking the pieces you've been given and creating something quite spectacular that hopefully will last. So I do get to look at a very long career in baseball with a litany of unprecedented and pioneering and never before blah, 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 blah in sports. And then at McDonald's, where, you're going to follow a superstar like a Pat Harris, where, she did the creation elements there. So what do you do with that, right? And so therefore, the way Pat had left things, it gave me the opportunity to participate in really, sort of super initiatives with the scale and the position of McDonald's. And one of my favorite is when we flipped the arches to make the W for International Women's Day. And the interesting piece of that, and I was a champion of that, but also very cautious about it, because I positioned it with, if what comes out of this is a whole new strategy, then we would have done this logo proud. If it's just a one-off for a day, this is like heresy. I came from a brand, where it is treasured and honored, things like logos. So when you start flipping and doing stuff to them, it has to be for the greater good. So happy to say that after flipping the arch to becoming W for International Women's Day, that's when we were able to launch the global gender and diversity strategy for the business. And so I am a proponent of doing it well, making it big, make it last, but do not become that impediment to the organization so your legacy doesn't become a part of legacy.
I really like that, like thinking about ensuring that your legacy isn't that, legacy, right? And I heard snaps when you said it the first time, so obviously that idea resonated.
And tweet it too.
Yeah, resonated with our audience. So, You know, I'm going to ask one more question about legacy, and then we're going to do sort of a call to action for our audience here before we open it up. So again, those of you that are here, if you have questions, get ready. It's almost that time. And those of you who are with us on the stream, put those questions in the chat. So there's a lot of, I think, unknown around how does a legacy happen, right? How does that form? What do you do there? You know, is it something that you plan for? Is it something that happens organically? You know, what advice could you share with our attendees about how a legacy happens, right? Like, how do you do that?
You know what, I don't think you can do legacy if you don't believe in the work. If you don't believe it, you can't make anybody else believe it either. And if you do anything with the intention of becoming a legend, you're going to fail. It's something that does happen to all of us. This is not us being special. This is us being people who chose to answer the call. And with that answer comes you delivering not only whatever the deliverable is, but the number one action item you'll have to take is determining that you do believe and that you are willing to be courageous and you are willing to deal with the consequential outcome, which isn't always a plus. Sometimes that's a minus. So it's not so much I decided I'm going to be a legend, I'm decided I'm going to leave legacy. It's like, I know this is so bad in the best way. I know this is ringing the bell in the loudest way. And I also know I am willing to deal with whatever comes with it. And then you do another one, and then you do another one, and then you do another one. And you try the best you can to sustain as long as you can. And to me, that's how legacy works.
Completely agree, 1,000% snaps up to that. I say it's specific to the diversity space. It has to be leaning into something you're irrationally passionate about. And you're going to do it because you're irrationally passionate about it. Many of us who are in the diversity inclusion space were in it when it wasn't cool. We're going to still be in it when it's not cool anymore. It's because that's what we're passionate about. And so the legacy follows, not because we intended to be legends or be risen up, but we've done the impactful work because we're passionate about it. I'd go beyond that and say for those of us who are in these roles, thinking about the things that stick, things about the things that have staying power, the procedural and organizational and operational things we can do. Too often in diversity inclusion programs, particularly if you're the leader of the program, you're the figurehead, it feels like you're incredibly busy every single day doing the diversity stuff, but you can ask at the end of the week, what have I actually done that's going to stick? You know, it's important to be doing the celebrations of heritage and working with the employee resource groups, and you can stay incredibly busy responding to inquiries, external and internal, but think about those tools and processes you can put in place that live beyond you, whether it's putting leadership accountability around having meeting some goals of representation and making sure that your senior leaders are accountable to that. That's going to stick after you leave. Or if it's mandatory inclusion training, whatever it is, it could be most fundamental things, but it's those things that now become part of the process that aren't just Wendy's thing, they're not just Brian's thing, they're now institutional. And someday someone will say, that's awesome, we do that. Wendy is the one who put that in place, right? And so legacy comes from focusing on the operational and organizational cadence of those things that stick after we move on to the next role.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I see our friends from HACR are standing in the aisles with the microphones for questions. So if you have some questions, please go ahead and line up. We'll go here first. Yep.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Pamela Bergen. My question for you, there was a study that showed that in 2021, well, from 2020 to 2021, there was a spike in the percentage of director of diversity roles on LinkedIn. It increased by 70%. I'm curious, what criteria would you recommend to filter companies that are actually walking the walk and dedicating resources meaningfully versus companies that are doing something to just check the box?
It's a great question.
The public trust. It's interesting who just got here. And if a company who just came to this space in 2020 or since that time, take a good look at what they're promising to deliver. And if they're promising to deliver, how honest are they being about what they did before? So if they are telling as much of the truth as they can, if they're going into it now being very transparent. The other part of that is they should leave it open for how you can test me. So I'm going to make this announcement. We're now establishing the blah, blah, blah for the first time in our history. We've been late to the game on this, but we're going to do it now. And so what we're looking at by the year so and so, and this is what we're going to accomplish. So that they are not only announcing this formally, but they're actually also setting up the audit or the criteria for you to benchmark that performance. So that's sort of for the new kids on the block. For folks who've been at it for a while, just check out the track record. Yep. And that's what a lot of companies are really trying to avoid, that I call it unspoken truth being spoken everywhere. I didn't directly tell you what I was doing. I implied what I was doing, and my performance was performative. And so even for those companies, they need to now tell you something that they're doing that's really different. And again, building accountability actually into the statement itself. It's not just enough to give us these jobs, right? So I would say the companies that are being a little bit more honest, creating a little bit more substance to what they're doing, and giving you a backdoor opportunity to actually assess if they've been successful.
I agree. It's honesty and transparency. It's asking the question, how long has this role existed and how many people have filled this role? Is this a brand new role? Are we just coming to the game, or has this existed for a while? It's looking at the corporate citizenship report or whatever reporting that the company is doing around the space to see how transparent they are. And in my view, it's okay if the numbers aren't where they should be and they haven't made enough progress, if they're transparent about where their gaps are and the fact that it's important for them that they invest. But I would also ask some honest questions about the role. How much budget will this role have, and how much staff will this role have, and where this role will report? I think, harking back to those numbers about this record number of these roles being opened, I think you've probably also seen record turnover in those roles because the company says we got to do it, we need to do it in the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all these bad things. We must rush to the gate to put someone in this role and set that person up for infinite lack of success, because they don't have budget, don't have support, they're just lip service, and I think that does no good for any of us. And so you don't want to put yourself in a position of running into a role, hey, I'm the first one to do this, this is great, if you're not being supported in the way that you should be.
That's right.
Okay, my name is Juan Quintero. I am a project manager for Chevron. My question is around this being the moment for diversity and inclusion, as well as ESG. You both mentioned that multiple times. Yet, we also live in the age of misinformation, and our nation is highly polarized. How can companies, employee resource groups, and individuals bring that other set of folks to the table? How can we invite them to participate in the revolution?
The reason I had to pause is because you opened the door for what is my seismic move. So Wendy Lewis LLC, diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. But we are the creator of what I'm calling ally shift. In the presentations, there's a slide that one side of the slide is President Obama's inauguration. The Capitol has, millions of people, right? The other slide is January the 6th. And I asked folks, what are you looking at? And they talk about it. And I said, these are both pictures of allies. And so the reality is the word ally itself, even just as a standalone, now is a whole different concept and can feed on the very type of negative characteristics and characters that you're talking about. So I am going to say, and this is me, is less of converting them, and it's more of building up who are the allies. Because I look at it this way. There's always been extreme thought on this. but the chasm and the valley and the gap in between was pretty wide. It was a kind of neat place for allies to just kind of sit and do a lot of different things. I believe the width of that now is about a balance beam. And you can only stay on a balance beam for so long. And so it's a matter now of not only who wants to stand up, I call it standing straight in crooked rooms, who not only wants to do that now on behalf of others, including themselves, but what side of this are you going to end up on? Because the opportunity to kind of stay in the middle, that's drying up by the day. So my response to that is, you got to ally shift.
I'm going to answer the question with a question because I want to know your thoughts on this. So, and it's related, but it's something that I've struggled with lately is sort of the watering down of diversity and inclusion as part of this evolution where we've gone from chief diversity officers to chief inclusion and diversity officers to chief diversity, equity, inclusion officers to head of and the watering down of saying we can't boil the ocean, let's focus on this global category of women and to the extent that, and I'm all for extending the table so everyone can eat, we have to take a very comprehensive look and make sure there's a place for all, but I fear that we're moving to this point of belonging at the expense of what the numbers tell us are the marginalized black and brown groups. How do we continue to keep the focus there, but expand, like you say, into this broader, I'm not sure how to do that.
See, I also have a very conspiracy-driven mind.
Good.
This is the illusion. This is the trick.
Yeah.
Like I said, I've been in this for a while, and another reason why sometimes my peers weren't too crazy about my concepts. I haven't seen another sea that does what we've done to ourselves. You know, marketing has been marketing. Technology has been technology. Finance has been finance. No one has been as fickle with what I'm called or what I do. Back in the day, not very long ago, we'd be on panels like this. And if you saw any old tapes, you'll see me doing this because someone would say things like, well, I know I've been successful with my diversity practices because diversity belongs to everybody. And when I no longer have a job, then I'll know we got it done. I used to go like, are you crazy?
Do you ever hear CFO say, I want to work myself out of a job? Or
Nobody
CMO say
talks like that. So one, stop playing with the semantics. I'm going to really tick you off. My perspective is diversity is inclusion. Inclusion is diversity. Play with that. And while you're at it, understand it's equity that matters.
Yep.
So I'm not big on all of this. And when I work with my precious clients, and one in particular wants to wipe everything away and call it belonging. They even got a neon sign. And they're like, Wendy, what should we do? Why are you asking me? You got a neon sign out there. I said, but understand this, the diversity, inclusion, equity, that's the work piece. The equity and equality really is the execution proof piece. Belonging is trust. And unless you can affirm that you've created a culture of trust that's been affirmed because others have told you it exists, leave that word alone. So I want us to get in this lane, which is as wide as the eyes can see, and stop being confused about what we need to be called. Let's just get clear on what it is we need to do.
Amen.
So we have time for one more question. I'm not sure. It's not.
Testing.
There you
There we go.
I mean, my mouth's big enough I can actually just say it. So, it's so funny you started off with your definitions and coming into your conspiracy theories, which I don't want to get sidetracked, but I do want to stick to one thing. So, Harvard Business Review stated a couple years ago that companies that are diverse make 86% better business decisions, reflective of customer, which you talked about, but also reflective of who you're dealing with within the organization. The one thing I want to go back to is that when it comes to the fact of shareholders' wealth, which is something that doesn't change because it is, and I work in supplier diversity, so my questions are always going to be geared towards where I'm focused, is as we move forward, how do we be more inclusive? And then it's not as much inclusive as bringing them to the table, but the equity portions, because it relates to the fact of checking the boxes saying, I have a vendor that meets this criteria. However, the establishing of that vendor to grow within an organization, to provide a process to let them grow, to become a vendor that changes the wealth gap for their demographics is what I'm looking at. And I look at it from an ROI standpoint, because if you are serving 46% of the Hispanic community, how come you only have 1% in your supplier diversity program? And that still goes back to leadership from a standpoint of how come your executive leadership only has 0.
I'd say in the lunch panel, she talked about what gets measured gets done. I think on some level it's about that which we measure, and supplier diversity numbers tend to be not very granular in terms of what we measure. It's one big cumulative number of how much we spend with diverse suppliers. I think part of it's how we're going to measure what success looks like, not only what we're spending with diverse suppliers, but how many diverse suppliers we have as a percentage of our total supplier base, how many new suppliers have we onboarded, what's our percentage of diverse suppliers with spend of 100 million or more, right? What are we trying to solve for, and do we have meaningful metrics that help drive progress is one. And then I think as another is what you kind of referred to. If the goal at the end of the day is to provide wealth and opportunity in underrepresented communities, it's not just how much we spend with that first tier of suppliers, but what's the economic impact of the dollars that we spend, whether that's directly with the diverse supplier or with a majority-owned law firm, but employs partners that are diverse to work on our accounts, right? It's just thinking at the end of the day, what are we trying to achieve and what measures and accountability we have to really drive that?
I totally agree. It's really what's the objective, what's the commitment, and what's the strategy of the organization, because the business diversity platforms are as different from one company to another. So it really is, what are you really trying to do here?
And I'll take a moment of personal privilege, because for 8 years I led HACR's work on the Corporate Inclusion Index. And so if you look at the CII and the things that it measures in particular around supplier diversity, like Brian said, it's not just about what the total spend is with diverse suppliers. We ask them to break it down for each individual group. We look at things like, not only the tier 1 spend, but how are they engaging, again, with other businesses that perhaps are Hispanic owned or minority owned, and the way that then impacts the communities in which those businesses are embedded, as well as looking at development, right? And how are they working with those suppliers to make sure that they can handle the capacity that a large Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 company would need from their suppliers. So there are metrics that are out there. There are organizations like HACR that are looking at those things and challenging companies to make sure that they're doing the right thing as far as supplier diversity goes. Well, we have reached the end of our time today, so I thank you all for being here, both in person and online. Let's give our panel a round of applause.